People will say, well, there are many unanswered questions, and that's true. And for many years, the evolutionists were able to count on those questions staying unanswered. But here's the thing. We have many unanswered questions in the creation model. They have many unanswered questions in the evolution model. But in the past 50 years, lots of questions have been answered. And guess what, folks? Every answer went our way. You see, the problem is we, in the creation model, we have no answered questions that give us any problems. But for the evolutionists, they actually have answered questions that give them problems. We don't have that. You see, you can tell which guys are wearing the white hats and the black hats in this story. And for you youngsters, which are the Sith and the Jedis. You can tell by looking at this kind of thing. So what I want to look at tonight is the whole, I'm going to do a historical retrospect on junk DNA and bring you right up to the newest research findings that burst out on the scene in the scientific community just last semester, September 6th. But I want to work your way up to, I want to give you the historical perspective on the junk DNA thing. To this day, all textbooks and just about all of your biology professors who are evolutionists will tell the students, junk DNA proves evolution. Junk DNA proves evolution. In 1996, I was on false pretenses lured into the conference room at the science department at the college I was teaching at, and the dean of sciences and the chair of biology cornered me. Students, if we'll make a Star Wars allusion, it's just like when Darth Vader brought Luke to the Emperor that time. You remember, and he said, "It is you, my young apprentice, who are greatly mistaken." You know, this is what was happening. These two guys were going to turn me to the dark side of evolution. That was my first year at this college. I was a junior professor with no tenure. This was a dean and a chair. And the two of them went for 2 hours and 45 minutes trying to convert me to the dark side. Well, Dr. Friels didn't have a real good time of that, and at the end he stormed out of the conference room and he said, "This isn't over yet, Dr. Jackson." And it took him 5 years to get me fired, because I walked a tightrope there at that college, but all of us do. Isn't that right, Brother Edward? Yes, all of us do, if we choose to stand for the truth. Well, during that conversation, Dr. Friel says to me, "Dr. Jackson, what do you think about junk DNA then?" And I said, "Well, I think," and he interrupted me. He didn't even let me answer my question. He said, "You're going to say someday we're going to find a use for it, aren't you?" And him and Dr. Carr laughed at me to scorn. Well, it was in the year 2000 when the very first news started to trickle in that they were finding that sequences in the junk regions were actually doing something. Of course, I made an internet expose on that in the year 2000, and that was the year they fired me. But I win with Dr. Friels and Dr. Carr. But this thing of junk DNA has a much longer history, and it is a history of misdirected thinking. It is a history of just wildly run rampant egos and arrogance. Arrogance. The Bible says knowledge puffeth up, and there are a lot of puffed up people in the world. But Albert Einstein said that those who are interested in this enterprise of science encounter a spirit in the universe, a spirit vastly superior to man, and one before whom we must feel humbled. And I think true science is very, very humbling. People who are in it because they have little needs for their egos, I think that it puffs them up instead. And there are many spiritual things we could say about how to do the anti-pride thing, but let's go ahead and get started. I am convinced you cannot teach science without Calvin and Hobbes, Gary Larson's Far Side, and maybe non sequitur and a little Charlie Brown every once in a while. But here's your Calvin and Hobbes.
When you look at me, it's clear that my genes contain the evolutionary perfection of earthly DNA.
I am the culmination of creation. With no tail? I don't think so.
Stop that. My butt doesn't need aesthetic enhancement.
Now, some of you may remember that evolutionists always used to use the tailbone, the coccyx, the end of the spinal column, as proof of evolution. It's a vestigial organ. It's an organ left over from back in the days when we were fish and rats and worms. See, and all these different organs that natural selection hasn't weeded out of us yet because they're neutral, they don't have any function anymore, useless organs. You see, since we're so smart, if we can't figure out what it does, it must not do anything. This was arrogance, but almost excusable because, again, it was arguing from ignorance. It was arguing from unanswered questions. Just like Darwin, out of ignorance for cell biology, it wasn't until the 1950s we invented the scanning tunneling electron microscope. Well, the scanning electron microscope, and we began to see all the little organelles. I think if Darwin existed today, if he lived today, he'd have never said that cells could come from ocean water. Never, never. Or in some warm little pond. Or I'm actually getting off the subject, but you got me all interested. I got really revved up by being with Brother Boudreau. Boudreau? Is that right? Okay. Well, the vestigial organ thing was always an argument. It's still in the textbooks. Many evolutionists still say vestigial organs. I have never had one of them, not for 15 years, try to argue it during a debate, though, because they know it's now scientifically indefensible. But the vestigial organs, or let me call them junk organs, were seen as a proof of evolution for a long time. You know what? That thing worked a minute ago, Brother Bill. Uh-oh. I think it's my batteries. Sacrifice. I'm sorry. I truly am. I thought the batteries were pretty strong. I think I have some extra ones down in here, though. There's a little plastic dinosaur in there, too. He's probably behind the batteries. Nope, that's a pen. Well, I might just have to push the button like normal people. They are. You have 3 of them? Oh, how nice. Well, it will go smoother the rest of the night. Yeah, I should have seen the little red light. Oh, well. This was just going to be a little one trip, and I have a feeling I'm going to be here for a week because of the snow. But, okay, while the brother's getting me these AAAs, I'll continue on. In our arrogance, in the arrogance of the established scientific community, we said if we can't figure out what it does, it must not do anything. And then it was immediately pronounced evidence for evolution that we have these old leftover organs that are throwbacks. Thank you so much. I'll give them back after. Well, I only need 2. Hopefully these are the 2 that are charged and work. But the logic that was used at that time, you would think our evolutionary counterparts would have learned that was flawed logic, but they didn't, because they applied the same thinking to, you know what, I don't know, maybe this thing just, oh, there we go. Oh, it still says red. All right, there we go, it's working. Vestigial organs like the tailbone, okay, or the coccyx. This part here is not really vestigial. You heard it over and over and over and over again, and as our beloved late brother, Dr. Dwayne T. Gish used to say, can you really think of a better way to end the spinal column than that? It's true. Come on, that's designed. Plus, everyone in this room, except me, is using your coccyx right now. You're sitting on it. If without the coccyx you could not sit down comfortably, and you can't stand in the same position very long either. I was doing this presentation to combine 2 high school biology classes in Venezuela once, and they all were kind of laughing when I gave these explanations, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Also, in female humans, the muscles for childbirthing that push the baby out, the parturition muscles, are anchored on the coccyx. Also, the muscles that control the contraction in your rectum to control your bowel movements are also anchored on the coccyx. I think these are functions, you know. And like I said, you're using your coccyx now. The teacher of those two classes was a biology teacher, and anytime a biology teacher has surgery, they always tell the class all about it, you know. And she had to have her coccyx surgically removed for bone cancer. Saved her life. But she had to have reconstructive surgery on her rectum. She had to have a C-section for her next baby she had because she couldn't push. And she couldn't sit or stand in the same position very long. And she had taken a walk outside the room to walk up and down the halls to feel better and come back in the room while I was doing this. So that's why the students were laughing. I don't understand the Venezuelan sense of humor, so I was afraid I'd said something funny. But the coccyx definitely has uses. All the muscles in the small of your back are attached to it in the back, and your guts are held in from the front by your six-pack, if you got a six-pack. I have a friend who says he has a one-pack. And anyway, but your abs hold in your guts from the front. There are no bones in that area. And so the muscles in the behind your entrails is a vase-shaped set of muscles that come back and attach, you guessed it, to the front end of the coccyx. It is not a useless organ. And if you've ever bounced down a set of stairs slipping on the ice and you bruise that little bone, you'll find out that God or evolution both put a lot of nerve endings in that for something that you're not supposed to guard as important. Well, all the other organs that they tried to say, the appendix, the tonsils, the wisdom teeth, I got this picture's off an evolutionist website where they're trying to say the wisdom teeth, the tonsils, the appendix, of course the coccyx, this is the blind cavefish thing, and these bones floating around in the whales that used to be legs. Well, this is not useless. Male and female reproductive organs in whales are all anchored on these bones, which are not connected in any way to the spine. It could never have been a leg. It's very, very important parts of the whale too. So vestigial organs has been pretty much debunked as a myth that was used to support evolution for decades. None of them ever says it to me in person, even though websites where no one gets to talk back, books where no one gets to talk back, and some professors where someone probably won't get to talk back will still use it. So, what's an evolutionist to do? Let's talk about new unknown things as proof of evolution. So what did they do after vestigial organs, as junk organs failed them as an evidence for evolution? Well, we began to analyze the human genome, and we found out 98% of it, we didn't know what it was doing. Eureka! That's because of evolution. It's evolution that did that, you see. We could only figure out what 2% of our DNA was doing. And we estimated there were 140,000 genes in there doing stuff, but the other 98% we did not know what it was doing. And since the same exact logic came into play in the 1970s, since we can't figure out what it's doing, it must not be doing anything. Ipso facto, it's proof of evolution. Leftover DNA, just like leftover organs. If they hadn't fallen for the exact same stupid sequence of logic that they used with the junk organs, it wouldn't be so bad. You know, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Now, I am not calling evolutionists stupid. I have not met a stupid evolutionist. These are smart people, often brilliant. But a smart person can believe a stupid thing if they want it to be true more than anything else. And we all have those things. Remember that last temptation you gave into? Oh, God doesn't really care, and this isn't going to hurt anybody. I'm only hurting myself. Of course, all the rationalizations. Satan will help you with this little project of rationalizing things. And, of course, it's worse if you're an unbeliever. He's right there at your elbow, ready to help you believe things that are foolish. And so, what's the new thing? Here we go. They decided we were doing all this analysis of the DNA sequences, and the evolutionists began to find whole giant areas that they felt were proof of the inefficient trial and error system that evolution purports is their version of genetics. Now, I always liked Will Rogers, but now I live in Oklahoma, so I really love to quote him. Scientists get bigger and bigger reputations the more they talk about things you can't check on. And so this was something no one could check on. Now, let me tell you a little story about DNA and how we figured out what the 2% was doing. See, DNA genes code for proteins. It's the central dogma of biology is transcription and translation. And so what we'd do is we'd find all the proteins in the body and it kind of leave a biochemical trail, and we can trace those proteins. After we broke the genetic code in the 1960s, we could trace those proteins back to the gene that had the DNA code for that protein. So when we did that, we only could figure out what 2% of the genes were doing. But you see, these other genes could actually be active and doing something else besides coding for proteins, and we'd never know it. See, it did not leave a paper trail. So we couldn't figure out the 98%. But like I said, immediately the evolutionists jumped on this as more of the overwhelming evidence, as they always say, for evolution. Marilyn Beausavant is in the Guinness Book of World Records as having the highest IQ in the world. She's a member of the same organization I am, Mensa, the High IQ Society. You got to be in the 98th percentile of IQ to get in. And she's the world's most famous Mensan. In Parade magazine, she has this column, Ask Marilyn. Look at what she said. Be able to defend your arguments in a rational way. Otherwise, all you have is a what? Opinion. There's nothing wrong with having an opinion. But if you put it in books and on PBS specials, you know, the History Channel and the Discovery Channel, and you package it up and sell it to people as fact, proven fact that only idiots would disagree with, now you're a liar. You either lied or you have believed a lie. Either way, it just isn't true. In 2007 here, Newsweek magazine, there's an article, The New Science of Brain and DNA is Rewriting the Story of Human Origins. If they have to keep rewriting their story every time some new fact rolls in, what does that tell you about the story? It's just like someone who has told you a lie or told you something that wasn't true and they didn't know, and facts just mess it up for them. And they have to say, you know, I saw you kissing a girl in the parking lot, John, you know, and John, no, that was my sister. You don't have a sister. It was my cousin. What? No, there was a guy that looked like me, you know, it was snowing, you couldn't tell, you know, how could you tell? You know, see what I mean? When your story isn't true, you get all these little dog ate my homework excuses that have to be played in for this to work for you anymore. And that's what was happening with evolution. Look at what it says here. They admitted in 2007 that fossils and missing links just weren't working for them. Look what it says about the last creature ancestral to humans as well as chimps, standing at a fork in the family tree as momentous as it is contentious. Fossils never resolved when the lineages of humans and chimps split. DNA might. So the big hero in the mid-2000s was going to be DNA. Okay, so the fossils never showed how humans evolved. I mean, this is inside the cover of this. That's what this is. This issue of Newsweek. DNA is going to be our heroes. That's what they were thinking in the mid-2000s. DNA is going to do it because the missing links have, well, we call them missing for a reason. Missing links stayed missing, so let's try DNA. So we'll talk about genes. John Hefner gave me that. Vestigial genes. So there's my intro. I just wanted you to see they did this whole thing before with organs they couldn't figure out what they were doing and said it was proof of evolution. Unanswered questions mean evolution is the explanation. And now they're doing it, and they have been doing it for 30 years with genes that we don't know what they're doing. Genetic material that we don't know what it's doing. We just call it the junk sequences.
A snow snake's got me. Horrible inner teeth on its separately moving upper jawbones are pulling me down its frigid gullet. Run for your life. At least I have a life, unlike some weirdos I know. I suppose if I had 2 X chromosomes, I'd feel hostile too.
Well, I mentioned this Calvin and Hobbes for a specific reason. You see, in the year 2000, when we first found a hint that the junk DNA was doing something, it was this. Okay, every male in the room is proof you can live with just 1 X chromosome. I only have 1 X chromosome. But every female in the room has got 2 X chromosomes, a double dose of those genes. Now, normally, a trisomy or an extra dose of any kind of gene normally hurts you. So how do females live with this extra dose of an unnecessary extra gene? Well, we found out in the year 2000, well, we knew it in years before, but we found out how in the year 2000. We knew that in females, half the genes on one of the X chromosomes just deactivate, and the other half on the other X chromosome just deactivate and shut down. And some of the genes stay open on both of them for things that a female needs a double dose of. And it just works out perfectly, but we didn't know how. In the year 2000, we found there was a sequence of genes that seemed to be controlling the entire operation, telling which genes to shut down, which genes to power up, and which genes to pump out extra proteins or translate to extra proteins and how much and how many and when. We're all being coordinated by a series of DNA sequences in the DNA that wasn't making proteins, and it was in the junk region. In the junk region. Here's the article from the Washington Post that reported the research. First, it appears that strange sequences of DNA previously thought to be useless are key to the inactivation process, suggesting that similar stretches in other chromosomes may similarly be involved in regulating gene activity, suggesting, in other words, that junk DNA in other places in the genome was actually doing something purposeful too. And in the next few years, we discovered 5 genes total that were doing this stuff. That were in the junk sequences. The FOXP2 gene, the FOXP2 gene, which controls brain development as you develop your brain and when you're an embryo, and continues development for the first year of life. That gene is only a little different from the one in monkeys, but it regulates our brain growth, makes our brains 3 times bigger than chimps, and we can talk, and chimps can't. And everyone understood this, but it turns out that the regulatory part of this gene was in the junk sequence. It turned out every one of these we were discovering that were doing something were not making proteins, but they were telling all the other genes when to do it. They were the main circuit board for the entire operation. It turned out that every time we found one of these genes in the junk sequence doing something, it was calling all the shots. These are master control genes, master regulatory genes, homeobox genes, Hox genes. These were the genes that told all the other ones when to do it, how much to do it, and when not to do it. All the other gene activity had been mysteriously under the control of some central CPU, central processing unit, all this time, and now we found out it was the junk DNA. Ooh, if I was an evolutionist, I'd have gotten a little weak in the knees right about those years in 2003, especially since in 2007 they were saying DNA is going to be the hero of evolution. Not so. The answers to the unanswered questions started rolling in. In 2001, scientists were amazed that the human genome didn't have 140,000 genes, but 35,000, as the Human Genome Project was rolling underway. Hadn't been completed yet. The vastly lower number meant the human genome is much more complicated than previously thought. Genes can be read forward, the DNA sequence can be read this way and a protein comes out, or backward. The very same gene can be read in reverse order and it still makes sense. And it actually codes for another protein that has another vital function. And 3-dimensionally. That's very complicated, but yeah. We even think that maybe, we know that some genes can get methylated and that changes their function. It changes their activity, how active these genes are. We even think that the DNA strands are wound on little microscopic spools called histone proteins. Now we're thinking that the histone proteins themselves may actually have coded information that is used for building another copy of you. When you have kids, you reproduce a new copy of you that's half you and half your spouse. But even the histone proteins may be. And Dr. John Sanford, a brilliant geneticist and a born-again, biblical, young earth creationist, and a forerunner in genetic research, says he thinks that even codes are overlain within codes. Codes are nested within codes. That maybe, like that Da Vinci Code, funny thing, that every fifth nucleotide sequence, if you read that, it codes for another protein. And every fifth of those, information nested within information, within coding, within coding, within coding. It's far more complicated than the one gene, one trait theory that we held to in the 60s even. Far more complicated. And we've just scratched the surface. So the fact that only 35,000 genes could code for all the stuff we need must mean it's a far more complex and well-organized system if it can get all that done with just 35,000 genes. The genes evidently perform multiple functions to direct the production of hundreds of thousands of components that comprise the human body. In 2004, in Nature magazine, one of the most premier journals of science in the world, the oldest and most revered, and an evolutionist journal, said, now the International Human Genome Sequencing Consortium has further revised that number down to only about 25,000. By the time the Human Genome Project was done, it got down to 22,000 genes only. And this small number blows our socks off, says Nature magazine. We have a long way to go to understand how all the parts revealed by the genome sequence together make life. What they didn't realize yet, and didn't admit yet, was that the junk sequences, so proof of evolution, since they weren't doing anything, and they were obviously just leftover remnants from back in the day when we were worms, fish, and rats, they didn't realize that they just couldn't see. It was against their mindset. This is what I call in science inertial thinking. I was just teaching my physics class last week the first law of Newton, which is the inertial law, which says that it's the resistance to change in motion or direction. Often people's thinking has a resistance to change in motion or direction, unless an outside force acts on it. And if your inertia is very, very great, it'll have to take a big force to act on you, to get you to change your mindset. But bound by evolutionary precepts, they were blinded to the notion that the junk sequence could be the answer. We weren't. We were expecting it. They were blindsided by their mindset and worldview and their model, not us. We were right in the end, Dr. Friels and Dr. Carr. You might have heard of this happening when a leading atheist now believes in God. The Associated Press reported Anthony Flew in 2004 did not become a Christian, but decided, guys, I'm sorry, I can't be an atheist anymore. There's got to be a God. Why? What I think the DNA material has done is show that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements together. Intelligence had to be involved, guys. There's got to be a God. I don't know whether it's Vishnu or Krishna or Jehovah or whatever, or Allah, but there's got to be a God. I'm sorry. And it was the evidence that led his mind to this. Richard Sternberg, who is the guy that was the key in the Expelled movie, No Intelligence Allowed, with the big scandal up at the Smithsonian, Richard Sternberg and James Shapiro wrote in 2005 in Cytogenetic and Genome Research, one day we will think of what used to be called junk DNA as a critical component of truly expert cellular control regimes. That was what was being hinted at. That's 2005. Now, at the same time, there was a man Okay, here it is. Philip Kitchener at Columbia in the Washington Post newspaper, and I'm from Washington, D.C., very influential city, very influential paper like the New York Times, 2005, this guy said, a lot of the DNA, and this is the same year, a lot of the DNA in there is not needed. It's junk. If it's intelligently designed, then God needs to go back to school. Yeah, it's just a teeny bit arrogant. Okay? But this just shows how blinded Professor Kitchener was at the time. The evidence is already rolling in, and he was just in denial, denial, denial. You have to deny when you have a faith-based proposition that you don't want to know any more facts than you already know, because it's working for you now. Christians, Bible-believing folks, never, ever, ever run truth. Jesus said truth will make you free. Look, this book, I have tested it on everything I possibly can. I haven't found it lying to me about history, psychology, sociology, finances, romance, involvement, friend issues, science, and math. The day I catch it bald-facedly lying to me or being wrong, I may just burn this book of myths and fairy tales and go live a real life. But so far, it's turned out to be right about every single thing I've ever been able to check it on. Like a friend who's never lied to me, I continue to trust it. In every answered question, it answered this way, the way it says. And so for the unanswered questions, I've decided to go ahead and trust it. Like a friend who I trust, even though I can't check up on them, well, you've never lied to me before, so I believe you. Don't think we're the ones in la-la land. It's them. It's faith that they are resting on, not science, not data. And this proves it. It's a mindset. An example of the multitasking genes, University of London recently discovered, this was 2006 in Discover magazine, that the CX26, a gene associated with deafness and hearing, also plays a role in helping wounds to heal. Okay, the very same gene that heals your cuts codes for proteins involved in the structures and the enzymes that you need for hearing. Same gene. It's impossible to know the precise value of a gene. There is value in assuming that inconvenient but survivable genes might be there for a reason. Starting to catch the glimmer in 2006 that we were right all along. Question, what about junk DNA? 2005, Science News Magazine. Answer, it's possible non-coding DNA contains signals that decide when other genes are switched on or off. We've always been saying that it must be doing something, and probably something like this. 2006, Time magazine said, the non-coding region of the genome, once known dismissively as junk DNA, is crucial. It was public knowledge by the year 2006, and so we're talking 7 years ago, that junk DNA was probably not junk. But still, all the professors, I gave this presentation last semester at a community college in Missouri, and the campus minister who had invited me to speak said the next day he heard some of the evolutionists talking in the hall, and they were saying, well, we're just going to have to find something besides junk DNA to prove to the students evolution is true. They're running out of aces up their sleeves, folks, and we're not. October 26th, that same issue of Time magazine had a special issue, How We Become Human. How We Became Human. There's so much I could say about this picture. I'm going to go over time, I know, as it is. But hopefully, my wife says you're long-winded, but you're not boring. I'm interesting at least, so I'll try and keep you, entertained. This is all funny to me anyway. But every once in a while, these big magazines will put out a special issue on why evolution is true for the general public to read. You know, if you got to keep saying it over and over again, guess what that means about it? You got to keep trying to prove it all the time. It's true, and no one would question it. Well, then why do you have to say so much about it? The people who talk the most are packing the least often. This is from the article from that issue, and we're going to look right here, on page 48, Time magazine, October 2006. Look what it says. Those molecular switches lie in the non-coding regions of the genome, once known dismissively as junk DNA, but later rechristened the dark matter of the genome. You know, when they don't know what something is, they just call it dark matter or something. The new chair of physics at, I think it was Yale, a lady, very honest lady, said about dark energy. She said, dark energy is just code for we don't have a clue. I really can admire someone who disagrees with me on many things, but at least comes out honest with, well, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. People who tell you that they know all the answers are, yeah, I just pretty much la 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 la. I just, you know, I'm pretty tired of listening to them at that point. Somebody wrote on the Facebook page this week of Creation Truth Foundation, well, with your kinds of attitudes, what agenda do you have? Dr. Jackson, obviously you have an agenda. And I said, the agenda is on the front page of our Facebook website, Facebook page. And I said, and we do have an agenda. You're right. But we back it up with data, facts, evidence, and logic. And anybody that tells you they don't have an agenda is a liar. They really have an agenda, and they're trying to push it. We're just rolling with it. So that's what I had to say back to him. Dark matter. Much of the genome's dark matter is, in fact, junk. The residue of evolutionary events long forgotten and no longer relevant. But a subset of the dark matter, known as functional non-coding DNA, comprising some 3 to 4% of the genome and mostly embedded within and around genes, is crucial. The coding genes are much easier for us to study, said Sean Carroll, who was at University of Wisconsin at the time. I think he's out at Berkeley now. But he's the one that wrote that book on Darwin's theory, All Forms Most Beautiful. And he also wrote that book there. Yeah, the coding regions are easier. The ones that code for proteins are easier to study for the reason that I explained to you. But at this point, we thought 2% of the genome was all we knew what it was doing. Now they're saying in 2006, 4% is actually junk DNA that's doing something. That's double the 2%, you see. It started looking pretty bad for the evolutionists at this point, but they still weren't catching on. This guy here, Svante Pääbo, was one of the runner-ups for Discover Magazine's Greatest Achievements in Science for 2006. He completed the chimp genome and the Neanderthal genome. He's kind of a strange little guy, but he works out at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany. But look at what he found out about the FOXP2 gene. He says in 2002, he reported a gene known as FOXP2, which plays a role in language acquisition. It produces a subtly different protein in humans than chimps. Although the difference is small, just 2 amino acids. Now, most proteins are like 400 or 500 amino acids long. So just having 2 amino acids different from a chimpanzee's amino acid is pretty tiny difference. But he says, although the difference is small, it is most likely significant since the alteration was strongly favored by natural selection starting less than 200,000 years ago. But what is the upshot of it? Our brains are 3 times bigger and we can talk. Gene sequences alone do not tell the story. Pääbo's also found that differences in gene expression, how active a gene is, may have played a role in creating the gap between chimp and human brains. Well, how do you tell a gene to work overtime on the brain? Something must be doing it. It's a fantastically complex crisscrossing network of gene communication systems that we have only scratched the surface on now that's doing that. We now know that, but we also don't know how it works. Genes are amazingly complex, and they are a real problem for evolution to explain. For example, in 2002, the German evolutionist Svante Pääbo found only tiny differences in the chimp versus human FOXP2 gene located in the so-called junk DNA sequence that evolutionist says don't do anything. But it actually controls the speech center of the brain. There's only a 2 amino acid difference between chimps and humans. That isn't really enough to make us talking chimps mute. So Pablo says it's gene expression that makes a difference, not the genes. He said 10% of the human versus chimp genes studied are expressed at significantly different levels in the two species. Our genes are very similar to chimpanzees, but that's because their physiology and their body structure is more like us than any other living thing. I mean, they don't have claws, or they have nails like us. They have opposable thumbs, although they have them on their feet. There are some differences, obviously. But the big difference isn't the genetics, even if it is 98% the same as ours, or 90 or 80%, whatever. We would expect their genes to be most like ours because they look like our bodies. There are some very big differences, of course, but that's another topic. But something else must be causing the huge differences between us and chimps besides the genes. And Pablo says it's that in 10% of the genes we studied between chimps and humans, the big difference is how much of the protein that gene is cranking out. But what controls that? Pablo was asking. So, somebody actually gave me this slide and they quoted me. So for a new trait to evolve, you can't just have one gene mutate. The regulatory genes that control it would have to mutate too. This gets way too complex to even imagine how it could really happen just by chance. So just for a gene to mutate, for evolution to go on, wouldn't be enough. The genes that control it would have to mutate at the same time, just by chance. See how this gets worse? Now that we understand, and some of you silver-haired people will know who I'm talking about, the rest of the story. Yes, you young people don't know who that is. You know, it's almost as famous as a van down by the river. Nope, that's even earlier than you, isn't it? Oh well, never mind. I'll try something else later. Now, look at what happened in 2007. The Washington Post issued this. The first concerted effort to understand all the inner workings of the DNA molecule is overturning a host of long-held what? Assumptions about the nature of genes and their role in human health and evolution, scientists reported yesterday. The new perspective reveals DNA not to just be a string of biological code, but a dauntingly complex operating system that processes many more kinds of information than previously appreciated. The findings from a project involving hundreds of scientists in 11 countries and detailed in 29 papers being published today, June 14, 2007, confirm growing suspicions that the stretches of junk DNA flanking hard-working genes are not junk at all. But the study goes further, indicating for the first time that the vast majority of the 3 billion letters of the human genetic code are busily toiling at an array of previously invisible tasks. 2007, that we were pretty much sure, okay, there aren't any genes that aren't doing anything except the broken ones. The ones that have mutated so badly they don't work anymore. Like maybe the vitamin C pseudogene. They call them pseudogenes because they figure out what they are, and they kind of look like a gene in other animals that does do something. So we might find all the pseudogenes are really master control genes too, but we still don't know. I'm telling you that. The jury's still out. We don't know. But we do have a lot of evidence showing us that junk DNA isn't. They made that up because it worked for them. In our arrogance, we figured since we can't figure out what it's doing, it's not doing anything. And by the way, that would be great proof of evolution. What do you think about the junk DNA, Dr. Jackson? I love it when a plan works out. Comes together. Okay, now I got one of them. There you go. And with great power comes. Okay, yes, I got to go with a new one with Andrew Garfield. He's a real good Spider-Man. He looks like Peter Parker. Okay, look at this too. This is from that article. The findings from a project involving let's go down here. I already did that part. The new work also overturns the conventional notion that genes are discrete packages of information arranged like beads on a thread of DNA. Instead, many genes overlap one another and share stretches of molecular code. As with phone lines that carry many voices at once, that arrangement has prompted the evolution of complex switching, splicing, and silencing mechanisms, mostly located between the genes to sort out the interwoven messages. So they're trying to spin doctor this to be an evolutionary achievement. But it really, really is, when you actually know what they're talking about, it's magnificently too complex of an interwoven system for any of this is irreducible complexity to the nth degree. Just can't. Complicating the picture, it turns out that genes and the DNA sequences that regulate their activity are often far apart along the 6-foot strands of DNA intricately packaged inside each cell. Now let me just point out to you what they found out. That the gene that controls the regulation of another gene could even be on a different chromosome. It could be on the other side of the cell, but we have traced the effect and we know this gene tells these genes on that chromosome what to do. We haven't been able to figure out how that happens, but we know it is happening somehow, because if they mutate that gene and get rid of it or deactivate it, then this one goes out of control. They've figured this out. It's kind of cool. How they communicate is still largely a mystery. This is 2007. Altogether, the new project shows that the simple sequence of DNA letters revealed to great fanfare by the $3 billion Human Genome Project in 2003 was but a skeletal version of the Human Construction Manual. It is the alphabet, but not much more, for a syntactically complicated language of life that scientists are just now beginning to learn. Surprisingly, though, the new work shows that most of a cell's DNA gets transcribed, changed from DNA language to RNA language. That takes a lot of energy out of the cell to do that. Why would it transcribe a gene that doesn't do anything? Raising questions about what all that RNA is doing. Some of it may be doing nothing. It may be like clutter in the attic, Francis Collins, head of the Human Genome Project, says, noting that clutter could be useful when conditions change and evolution needs new material to work with. Well, that's really scraping the bottom of the barrel for saying it's all part of our plan. I did that on purpose. And I'm sorry, Collins. I've met Francis Collins, really nice man, plays the guitar at the praise band at his church. He is a professing Christian, but believes that evolution was the way God did it all, and pronounced that on the Colbert Report, and also in his book, The Language of God. Same article. We are increasingly being forced to pay attention to our non-gene DNA sequences, said John M. Greeley of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, wrote a commentary in today's issue of journal Nature, where one of the new reports is being published. The expectation was that many of the most active DNA sequences in humans would be prevalent in other mammals too. In other words, the real active DNA in us would be present in the rats we evolved from and the monkeys we evolved from. Because evolution tends to save and reuse what works best in the past, keep it for the future. But more than half of the real active human sequences were not even found in other creatures. Oh, that doesn't go with the evolution story. Then where'd we get these genes if we didn't get them from, possums and lemurs and monkeys and rats? Oh my. Where did we... It says here, more than half of them weren't even found in other creatures, which, what? Here we go. Here it comes. Suggests they might not be very important in people either. Again, the same exact misfit logic. Well, it doesn't fit the evolution story, and we can't find it in other animals, so it must not be really important in us, since our cousins, the apes, don't have it. See? Evolutionary thinking forces them to say something like that. If I was an evolutionist, I'd have to say it too. But that just doesn't work with the big picture. Step back and take a look at the view. That does not belong there. Something's amiss. Said Ewan Burney of the European Bioinformatics Institute in Cambridge, England, a coordinator of the ENCODE effort. ENCODE is the acronym for the big genome project that's been going on. Here we are, 2007, Nature magazine and Nature Reviews Genetics. About 93% of the genome, 2007, 93% of the genome is transcribed, not 3% as expected. This is totally flipped on its head on them. If I was an evolutionist, I'd be wetting my pants right now. I'd be like, ooh, how could I have been so wrong? How could I have taught so wrong? How could I have believed so wrong? How could I have written that book that's now a textbook so wrong? What's going to happen to my federal funding? The National Science Foundation's not going to give me more grants. I might lose my endowed chairmanship. I might lose my reputation. I based my whole life on this stuff being true. These people have a lot at stake causing them to have inertial thinking. They really they're fighting for their lives, for their careers, for their reputations, for the authority that they now wield in the scientific community. There's a reason why they don't want any of this stuff to change what the textbooks have been saying that they have been writing. And I can understand why. But the spirit of humility that should be the true investigation of science should lead them to say, I was wrong. Let's continue on in the search for truth. Linus Pauling, the guy who discovered vitamin C is good for the common cold, who discovered the principle of electronegativity in 1932 and won the Nobel Prize in the early 1960s for being a famous scientist against the proliferation of nuclear weapons during the Cold War, Linus Pauling said, "Science is a search for the truth, the effort to understand the world." I was debating 3 evolutionists against me at DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana, and I made the statement that science is a search for the truth, and they all just about fell out of their chairs. No, 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 no! And one of them stood up as a spokesman. He goes, "Science is not a search for the truth." And I'm like, well, what? You know? He said, "It's a discussion." Like that was smart. Okay, take your postmodernism stuff and discuss whether you should walk out in front of a Mack truck or not. You know, everything's not real mysterious when they're balancing their checkbooks or they decide whether to eat a piece of meat that's turned all green and mushy in the refrigerator. You know what? Facts are important then, but not when they're behind their ivory tower pulpits in their classrooms pontificating and sounding very self-important. All of a sudden, philosophy and their grand, deep thoughts are, and just a little clue to you, postmodernistic thinking has bashed out of people the ability to think linearly. We used to go A, B, C, conclusion, 1, 2, 3, conclusion, black and white conclusion. But they actually train people to think that conclusions are wicked and evil. To say that you can conclude anything is arrogant. Instead, they believe you should think in circles and gather wool as you do that, you see. Circles, circles, circles. Well, when I was a little kid, I liked the merry-go-round. You know, now I still don't get along with horses, but I now won't ride a merry-go-round. I will ride a horse. My wife likes horses. You know, because you go someplace. Not this. They've been trained to think in circles. As a result, you, James, you, Nathan, and James's brother, you can think circles around these people while they continue in their forever loop they can never get out of because they've been trained it's immoral, and as a result, all the gears are rusty for real thinking. For real thinking. You can, because you have not been given a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. You have the mind of Christ. The truth has set you free. Jesus is the way and the truth and the life. And I'm not just saying a religious thing here. I'm saying that if God's real and Jesus is His Son, Jesus created the worlds, He is the truth. He said He is. Truth, we should never be afraid of truth. This is the only holy book in any religion on the planet that commands you to question your faith. That commands you to question whether God exists or not. In other religions, it's a sin. Test me, try me, prove me. Taste and see if the Lord is not good. See if I will not bless you. A good measure, shaken down, pressed together, overflowing more than you can imagine. Try me and see. This is the only faith where we're commanded to question. Why? Because it can take it. Put a microscope up to this, and all the truths found therein, scientifically, mathematically, historically, and it can take it. Why do you think evolutionist professors flip out and start spitting when they talk and cuss at a student for asking a simple question? How do we know that the Lucy chimp is our grandmama? Wah! If they're so confident, why do they scream and yell so much? Why do they abuse students, hold them up for ridicule? I can't tell you in my travels at college campuses how many students tell me horror stories about how they've been treated, how they've seen other students treated by bullies in the pulpits of their classrooms. They'll start the class at the beginning of the school year, the semester, saying, how many of you people here believe in God? And sometimes they'll ask for a show of hands. Well, if you still believe in God after the 17 weeks is over, I haven't done my job. They'll say that. Or they'll say, well, you won't by the end of this course. That's what they'll say to the class. And if a student challenges them, they'll hold them up to ridicule to their peers. It's a little rough for a 19-year-old to take. That's educational malpractice. What if a Christian did that in a public university? How many people here believe Jesus is Lord? Well, the rest of you, you're gonna believe it by the end of this course. Oh man, there'd be some tenure denial board assembled the next afternoon, and you'd be out of there before you could, two shakes of a lamb's tail. That's an old saying too. Okay, I'm sorry, I got all preachy, but I figured you were enduring it. People will say, well, there are many unanswered questions, and that's true. And for many years, the evolutionists were able to count on those questions staying unanswered. But here's the thing. We have many unanswered questions in the creation model. They have many unanswered questions in the evolution model. But in the past 50 years, lots of questions have been answered. And guess what, folks? Every answer went our way. You see, the problem is we, in the creation model, we have no answered questions that give us any problems. But for the evolutionists, they actually have answered questions that give them problems. We don't have that. You see, you can tell which guys are wearing the white hats and the black hats in this story. And for you youngsters, which are the Sith and the Jedis. You can tell by looking at this kind of thing. So what I want to look at tonight is the whole, I'm going to do a historical retrospect on junk DNA and bring you right up to the newest research findings that burst out on the scene in the scientific community just last semester, September 6th. But I want to work your way up to, I want to give you the historical perspective on the junk DNA thing. To this day, all textbooks and just about all of your biology professors who are evolutionists will tell the students, junk DNA proves evolution. Junk DNA proves evolution. In 1996, I was on false as proof of evolution. It's a vestigial organ. It's an organ left over from back in the days when we were fish and rats and worms. See, and all these different organs that natural selection hasn't weeded out of us yet because they're neutral, they don't have any function anymore, useless organs. You see, since we're so smart, if we can't figure out what it does, it must not do anything. This was arrogance, but almost excusable because, again, it was arguing from ignorance. It was arguing from unanswered questions. Just like Darwin, out of ignorance for cell biology, it wasn't until the 1950s we invented the scanning tunneling electron microscope. Well, the scanning electron microscope, and we began to see all the little organelles. I think if Darwin existed today, if he lived today, he'd have never said that cells could come from ocean water. Never. Or in some warm little pond. Or I'm actually getting off the subject, but you got me all interested. I got really revved up by being with Brother Boudreau. Boudreau? Is that right? Okay. Well, the vestigial organ thing was always an argument. It's still in the textbooks. Many evolutionists still say vestigial organs. I have never had one of them, not for 15 years, try to argue it during a debate, though, because they know it's now scientifically indefensible. But the vestigial organs, or let me call them junk organs, were seen as a proof of evolution for a long time. You know what? That thing worked a minute ago, Brother Bill. Uh-oh. I think it's my batteries. Sacrifice. I'm sorry. I truly am. I thought the batteries were pretty strong. I think I have some extra ones down in here, though. There's a little plastic dinosaur in there, too. You know, he's probably behind the batteries. Nope, that's a pen. Well, I might just have to push the button like normal people. They are. You have 3 of them? Oh, how nice. Well, it will go smoother the rest of the night. Yeah, I should have seen the little red light. Oh, well. You know, this was just going to be a little one trip, and I have a feeling I'm going to be here for a week because of the snow. But, okay, while the brother's getting me these AAAs, I'll continue on. In our arrogance, in the arrogance of the established scientific community, we said if we can't figure out what it does, it must not do anything. And then it was immediately pronounced evidence for evolution that we have these old leftover organs that are throwbacks. Thank you so much. I'll give them back after. Well, I only need 2. Hopefully these are the 2 that are charged and, and work. But the logic that was used at that time, you would think our evolutionary counterparts would have learned that was flawed logic, but they didn't, because they applied the same thinking to, you know what, I don't know, maybe this thing just, oh, there we go. Oh, it still says Rouse, and that was the year they fired me. But but I win with Dr. Friels and Dr. Carr. But this thing of junk DNA has a much longer history, and it is a history of misdirected thinking. It is a history of just wildly run rampant egos and arrogance. Arrogance. The Bible says knowledge puffeth up, and there are a lot of puffed up people in the world. But Albert Einstein said that those who are interested in this enterprise of science encounter a spirit in the universe, a spirit vastly superior to man, and one before whom we must feel humbled. And I think true science is very, very humbling. People who are in it because they have little needs for their egos, I think that it puffs them up instead. And there are many spiritual things we could say about how to do the anti-pride thing, but let's go again and get started. I am convinced you cannot teach science without Calvin and Hobbes, Gary Larson's Far Side, and maybe non sequitur and a little Charlie Brown every once in a while. But here's your Calvin and Hobbes.
When you look at me, it's clear that my genes contain the evolutionary perfection of earthly DNA. I am the culmination of creation.
With no tail? I don't think so.
Stop that. My butt doesn't need aesthetic enhancement.
Now, some of you may remember that evolutionists always used to use the tailbone, the coccyx, the end of the spinal column, pretenses, lured into the conference room at the science department at the college I was teaching at, and the dean of sciences and the chair of biology cornered me. Students, if we'll make a Star Wars allusion, it's just like when Darth Vader brought Luke to the Emperor that time. You remember, and he said, "It is you, my young apprentice, who are greatly mistaken." You know, this is what was happening. These 2 guys were going to turn me to the dark side of evolution. That was my first year at this college. I was a junior professor with no tenure. This was a dean and a chair. And the 2 of them went for 2 hours and 45 minutes trying to convert me to the dark side. Well, Dr. Friels didn't have a real good time of that, and at the end he stormed out of the conference room and he said, "This isn't over yet, Dr. Jackson." And it took him 5 years to get me fired, because I walked a tightrope there at that college, but all of us do. Isn't that right, Brother Edward? Yes, all of us do, if we choose to stand for the truth. Well, during that conversation, Dr. Friels says to me, "Dr. Jackson, what do you think about junk DNA then?" And I said, "Well, I think, and he interrupted me. He didn't even let me answer my question. He said, "You're going to say someday we're going to find a use for it, aren't you?" And him and Dr. Carr laughed at me to scorn. Well, it was in the year 2000 when the very first news started to trickle in that they were finding that sequences in the junk regions were actually doing something. Of course, I made an internet expose on that in the year 2000.